Hello. That's much bigger than I was expecting. Very good. Well, I want to introduce you one of my friends. Last year, I introduced you to Spider-Man and Batman. I have very cool friends, so this year, I want to introduce you Pikachu. And he's going to help me out today. So let's see how it goes. So I'm Gerard Sans. I'm a Google developer expert, and basically what I do is I go to a lot of conferences and do this thing. As you can see, I'm very happy doing this. These past 2 years, I've been very busy, and you can see all these dots. You know, the pink ones are the ones I've been doing a talk. The green ones is the ones I'm going. So I'm going now, until the end of the year, I'm going to be in Iceland, in Reykjavik, and also Moscow. You can see also some of the stats. So I've done almost 60. I mean, this is my 60th talk. That's quite a lot in 2 years. I also blog, so maybe you have seen some of my blogs. These blogs are always in this Google Developer Experts publication. And just a few months back, I hit the 3-feature blog post at this publication. So that was cool. You can see all of these 3 blogs. Was very happy. I'm also running a couple of communities in London. One is AngularZone, which is around Angular and web. The other one is GraphQL London. Usually you will see me speaking about either of these 2 topics, Angular or GraphQL. This year I also been doing some hosting, some Master of Ceremonies, so I do some funny stuff, make the people play, make a fool of themselves. That's also nice. I'm not going to do anything like that today, but maybe you will see me doing a Master of Ceremonies. This year was quite interesting because I was able to run a conference, and this one was the first conference running during a cruise. And this was a cruise running, departing from Miami. You can see the organizers here. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. Maybe this is not the right conference, I'm sorry. And everything happened in that boat. That was crazy. The other thing that I did this year, I'm also a trader, and this was a bootcamp, a week bootcamp in Canary Island. Really cool. I was doing it with Chris Sevilleja from Scotch.io in Las Vegas. So he joined me, and we ran this bootcamp for a week. You can see that I also was doing some surfing. It's always fun. This is in Spain. Very cool. And obviously, who would know that you need a banana to go? But yeah, it works. Also recently, I was able to run kind of a collaboration with Angular Academy. And this was also quite interesting. I was able to run the workshop with another trainer over there and visit, how is this called? Niagara Falls. So that was quite cool. I was also in Toronto. And yeah, you can see the end of that training. It was pretty cool. So this is a little bit of an intro of myself. Maybe some of you remember my talk last year on Angular router with Spider-Man. This talk, I'm going to introduce higher order observables with Pikachu. So stay with me. We will do some review. Yay! So this is these are you. Okay. Just to help. So what's an observable? So Pikachu is going to show us, and we have the timeline, and there are some events happening in that observable. And the first one I'm going to cover is next. So when an observable is emitting values, it will use this API, next. And for this one, it's a boring one. It's just emitting another value, number 1, again. And at some point, the observable can emit this complete event, which will finish the observable. So for this observable, we have these 3 values, and then it completes. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay. So what happens when there's an error? And I want to cover this because sometimes we just don't focus on error handling. So we have the same observable, as we saw. We get some values with next event, another next event, and then we have this error. And we represent this with this hash and some graphics. So now we covered the both scenarios. I'm going to show you how this would look if we were to implement exactly that observable with code. So we use the create API, and we use the observer to emit these different events. So I'm using the next to emit this value 1. As you can see in this code, I'm subscribing to that observable, and I'm just creating these 2 callbacks for handling next events and also complete. So for this next call, it's going to handle that callback. This L is just the console log. So that's going to log value 1. Then we have another next. We know that it's 3 times, so that's going to run exactly like this. You can see that the code is jumping, so we have this specific behavior from observables. And then when we call a complete, it will just go to the complete branch. So we can then use this to implement our logic. I'm also showing you how you can unsubscribe, and that's the code at the bottom. So it's pretty easy API. If we look at how we deal with errors, at the top, I always writing how this observable can be written down with using ASCII. So we can see these different values, and then after the second value, we have this error. So let's see how that executes. Now we throw this exception. We're going to catch that exception and pass it over the same observable. Otherwise, we will lose that information. So we have this try catch. That's going to capture the error, and I'm going to use the same observable to pass the information of that error. That's a specific from observables. And then I need to add a new entry to handle this scenario. Okay, quiz time. So I want to check how well you know observables. So we have this new API in RxJS 5.5. We have this pipe, and then we can pass the different operators as arguments, and you can see the different answers. So I will give you a couple of seconds to think about this. And I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is fail. I don't know what you were thinking, but you probably are wrong. The answer is that you need to always subscribe. We didn't subscribe. Nothing is going to happen with that observable. It's just a dead fish. Not good. Come on, Pikachu. Wake up. Another question. So we have now this off operator, which takes an argument, and internally you can imagine there's a next followed by a complete. So that's what's happening inside this off operator. Now we subscribe, no tricks now, we subscribe. And then we don't use the error, but we use the next and complete. So you can see there's some logging, and there's also log 2. So I'm gonna give you a couple of seconds to think what's the proper answer. And as you can imagine, yes, fail. You just fail. And why? Because observables, against popular knowledge, they are not asynchronous. They are synchronous by default. So in the last example, you would expect that the result would be synchronous asynchronous, but it's synchronous. So that's some interesting ideas. So Pikachu is not happy. And that's the reaction for a lot of people using observables. They are a little bit confusing sometimes, and they just behave in different ways. So we get the new release of RxJS, and with it, we have different operators that we can use. And I just put all of them in one slide. Can you recognize any of your favorite operators there? I mean, there are 120. So you must be feeling a little bit like overwhelmed, like Pikachu. I mean, Pikachu is a front-end developer. So I'm going to introduce you to some tooling that you can use, and this is Marvel testing. So Marvel testing is the tool that the core RxJS developers use to implement these 120 operators. And that gives you the tooling to really control the behavior of any kind of complexity around an operator. And I'm going to use that to explain higher order observables. And I didn't want it to go straight to them, so I'm going to introduce this tool so then you can use it in other scenarios as well. In order to use Marvel testing, you can either download the RxJS library and then run it and add your tests or specs, or you can use this library and then use it in your projects. So I'm going to introduce these RxJS marbles that allows you to do exactly that. Use the same marble tests in your projects. And I picked this one. There are different options, but this one is interesting because it can integrate with all of these test runners. In Angular, we are used to Jasmine, but then we also have Mocha. Jest is more popular in React. We also have Ava and Tape. So it's pretty complete, I would say. So let's see what features we can cover. Maybe you haven't heard about cold observables or hot observables, but usually when you are working with observables, you are using cold observables, which have a specific behavior. And usually when you introduce these two concepts, you use the example of YouTube videos. So if two of us go to a YouTube video and play the video, we get different instances. So we can run the video at different times and we will get exactly the same content. With hot observables, this would be the live streaming. So if we share a URL with a live streaming, it will depend when we join the live streaming. So we can lose some of the live stream that was happening before. We may lose some events when talking about observables. I'm going to show you some diagrams to help you out. One another thing that we can do with this Marvel test is control exactly the behavior of any observable. And we cover cold and hot, so that's pretty much everything. And then just to control everything that is possible, we also control time. So that means that in some specific operators, time will play an important aspect. So we can also do that by using this task scheduler. So we have some new Pokeballs, yay! And now we have Pikachu happy again. Let's start by covering call observables. So this is the observable that you will find usually when you are dealing with observables in your app. So that will behave more or less like this. We get the first subscriber, and that at the top is the observable as it's defined. And this is the same observable that we used before. So once we subscribe, we expect to get these different events and values, and also the complete, just in the same order that it was specified. If we get another subscriber, we will get exactly the same behavior. So we will spec exactly to get the 3 values and then complete. And I mean, there's nothing surprising here because that's the common observable that you use. Let's see how RxJS marbles help us. So when we are building these tests, we need to import marbles, and that will be the context for our tests. So we will wrap our test in this marbles call. Then we get hold of this marbles instance that I'm using M, and then we can use the different APIs to create the observables that we need. In this case, I'm using cold. And if you remember from some of the examples, this is the notation that I'm going to use. So these dashes, they represent 10 milliseconds. So this observable is going to wait for 10 milliseconds, wait again, emit the value 1, then wait for 20 milliseconds, emit the value 2, and then finish. And we know when these events happen because each character, it's telling us what frame this event happened. So we know that the third character is happening after 20 milliseconds. So we have control on the time. If you're familiar with test, you always test the real observable against some expectation. In this example, I'm going to use map operator. So let's say I want to see the behavior of map operator. And I'm saying that my expectations is exactly a cold observable, but now I change the last value just to see how marble test helped me. So I'm going to run this. I'm using this matcher to be observable, and that's going to go and go through these specs, and it's going to find if there is any difference between this, the execution of the observable that I want to test, and then the expectations. As you can see, I've changed the second value. Let's see what happens. So this will be the output. We start with this frame, which happens after 20 milliseconds, and you can see that these objects are representing the marble diagram that I wrote. So that's going to be value 1, and on the frame 50, which is the second value, is expecting a value 1, but it's getting a value 2. So this is a way to control the behavior of our observable. We are expecting a 1 because we have a map, but I put the expectations at 2, the tests are going to tell me. So I have total control on that, and I can find how the map operator is working in different scenarios. That's going to be the character marking the end of the observable. That's the complete notification. And we can see that all of these notifications match, but the second value. So this is how marbles can help us. We can also use, instead of these values on the ASCII marble argument, we can also use symbols. So we can use some more complex objects. The way it will work is we will define this object as values, and then we can pass it changing the 1s and 2s. We just use the symbols. And these symbols will match the properties on that values object. So now I'm using a map that it's incrementing the value. So it's going to start with an observable of values 1, and it's going to transform that into an observable of values 2. If we run this test, that's going to pass, and we can see the behavior. For error handling, we have some different APIs. Now I'm going to take this observable throw, just to emulate a failing observable. And I'm going to use the same approach. I'm going to define my map operator that's going to map the values. In this case, it's going to throw immediately. So that's going to take an undefined, because we have no symbols, as the second argument. But then we can specify the error that we are expecting. So we have this also control from the error side, which is very interesting. And we can use this matcher to just check all of these operators. So I have this demo, which I prepare for all the different scenarios. And I'm using this environment, which is a stack blitz. And I'm going to run exactly this, the the first test that I show you, and I'm going to change. So now you can see that it's just running this test and it's passing, and I'm going to just change just to see exactly what we saw in the slides. So that is giving me total control on the different aspects of these observables. And I'm going to use this approach to get the behavior of both cold and hot observables, and also introduce some of the higher order observables later on. You can come back to these demos later. So for hot observables, we have a slightly different behavior. And you will match the live streaming of the videos here. So when we have the first subscriber, nothing really different will show. But when we have the second subscriber, it depends when you subscribe to get only the events that were left. So in this case, we only have this last U value, one value, and the complete. So we are not getting the previous events because we just subscribe a little bit later. The way we implement this is by telling Marvel's test when we subscribe, and we use this caret symbol. So now I'm subscribing after the first value, and then I'm just getting the N notification. So that's going to work exactly as before. We can also specify when we unsubscribe, and this is a slightly different notation. You can see this exclamation point, and we can use this to have subscription, and that's going to look when we subscribe and unsubscribe, and also fail the test if that's not the behavior we are seeing. If we remove one of these, in this case, I just remove one frame, so it's missing just one frame, and that's the output. So it's telling me it's expecting this observable to end in the next frame, but it's ending in after 20 milliseconds, which is not right. So we have a really low-level control. So that's just the intro for higher order components. So let's go into them. And the main features of these observables is that they are observables of observables. And we have some specific operators. These are the basic ones. You can then go into the other ones later on. So let's see how this will run. With merge map, we will have something that looks like this. So we have the merge map from the original observable. Then we use a map to do a calculation on the value that we get. So we have these 1 and 3 values from the first observable, and then we are projecting the second observable and doing some calculation. You can see the code at the top. From this, we will get this output. So we get the first value, project the first observable, and then as the values are emitted, then I'm running the second observable. And that creates this output, as you see. I also added some labels so you can map the values, the V's and the X, make it a little bit easier to follow. That's how these Marvel tests look. So you can use the same approach that we used before. We have these cold observables with the different values. We also have the map with the merge map. And we can just use the same approach. We also add the subscription. For this example, I'm just subscribing to the whole life of this observable. For switch map, is a little bit more interesting. Switch map is going to unsubscribe from the latest inner observable. So let's see how that behaves compared to merge all. So we have the same projected observable, and then we get the first value. But then when we get the second subscription, it's going to unsubscribe. So we are not going to get these values anymore from that first observable. And now I'm just getting the values from the second one. So that's the slightly different behavior. This is how you would implement the marble tests. You can come to this later. But the interesting thing from this marble test is that you have total control on the behavior of the operator and the observables. You can describe what will be the input and what is expected output. And sometimes when you are discovering an operator, you want to test different scenarios, which will be very difficult to try in a live application. I'm going to skip that second demo. I'm going to show you that you can access from the same demo. You have these hot specs that you can run, and just show you how this looks actually on the RxJS library. So you can see this is this thing until change operator. And you can see that the specs from the library, it's just going to use the same notation that I explained during this talk. So for example, here, they are using this hot observable. They are showing the subscription going through all of the lifetime. And you can see the behavior of this thing until change. So I just gave you the tools to go into these 120 operators and just discover how are supposed to behave, which is not so easy sometimes. Okay. So that was pretty much all. Thanks for listening to me. Cheers.